Today's video sounds innocuous enough, and I guess in one sense it's innocuous. The schools of painting, but it does follow up on the heels of a follow up after my response to Hal's critique in the last one, which was where I talk about expression in impressionist expression. So this is a follow up. So I won't call it part two of that because it really isn't about expression anymore. And I'll just read you Devin's question. It's an interesting question, but at least it gets us to a place. It's a curious question. I think it's a fairly typical one of young people who haven't seen the world yet. And I don't mean that people can't have narrower attitudes even when they have seen the world, but I think this actually suggests as much about the writer and this other person, Hal, as it does about us, in a way that is, maybe you would say problematical. So, to be fair, says Devin, I think he's saying, and so now he's talking about Hal. Hal's saying that the Boston School places such a focus on the technique or manner in which you paint to such a degree that it lacks the spirit of experimentation. So this should all be up there in front of you, or spark. I can't say I agree, and by the way, I've numbered the points that I'm going to speak about. There'll be a few points in between. I can't say I agree with him because I haven't seen a lot of your work in particular, but I do agree with the critique of the Boston School in general. When I browse the work, it's almost impossible for me to figure out which is which artist. They all look the same because they're all painting in the same manner. It unfortunately puts such a rigid focus on principles that are more about getting a great painting, so that it seems to me to have pumped out a lot of guys that paint the same. I do wonder what you're talking about there, Devin, because a lot of guys, the Boston School produced a lot of painters, and they all paint like, the bigger part of them probably are women, by the way, and the greater part of them paint either like classic representational painters, or they paint with a heavy focus on various aspects of Impressionism. But if you're talking about the LAC studio and that whole body of people that are training out of the LAC background, I wish you would be more clear, because I'm guessing that's what you actually mean. You're saying we all look the same, and you name a couple people that studied with LAC and didn't study with Gamel. So that's really kind of important, and I would say also the word unfortunate might fit there. Pumped out a lot of guys that just paint the same. But that's not a good critique, by the way, and people used to say that about us in front of coming out of Gamel and other places. I can tell you that's not even plausible. If you study with somebody, of course you're going to be borrowing elements of what he does. I'm going to talk about schools of art in a second. So let's just, but you're there by choice too, and it's not like it's been worked into you in a way that makes you voiceless or choiceless. So principles and techniques are good, but at a certain point you have to put it all aside and paint instinctively and react quickly instead of methodically, in my opinion. Now, of course, Degas would dispute the idea of acting anything but methodically. So would Sargent, by the way. So that's an interesting, fascinating question, right? And that's one that fits right in with the mentality of a lot of what goes on in modernism today. And I don't mean representational painting, although it happens with certain elements of representational painting as well. I don't see any unique voice in it like you see when you look at a Zorn, Sorolla, or even a Sargent. Well, there it is. Instead, they all look like students of Sargent. To me, and that's really what a broad brush that is, Devin. I hope you realize what you're doing there. It's a little too up in your head intellectual and lacks the deep emotional aspect I look for. Now, I get that last line is actually it sounds to me like what Hal was critiquing, and a lot of people will do that. If you're an academic painter, for example, don't you all look the same? But let's just start from the beginning. And by the way, I suspect that what you do looks exactly the same as three other people too. So whether you even work with the same people is another question. So let's just start with this from scratch. To be fair, and the most important thing to be fair is to not make assumptions about other people's stuff. Number one, I'm going to tell you that I'm going to show you a picture of my background, and I'm going to ask you which of these two teachers I look like. So I'm down in the bottom right. I'm giving names, and all the ones I'm giving today, I'm giving names. Left is Gamel, a classic sort of academic thing, a standard way of working. Basically, that's Gamel, right? On the upper right is Brackman. These are the two guys that had the most dramatic influence on me. And then there's myself down below. Do you see, am I a clone of one of those guys? So I would really beg you to think this through, and don't use broad brushes, just to be fair, okay? Um, and by the way, I don't mean to keep doing these kinds of things, responding to people who are tending to be negative, but I think some of these points you're making are good and deserve answers in a positive answer, and I mean a respectful answer. Uh, so if moving along from there, um, you said uh, oh so actually let's stick with that for a second. So you talk about experimentation. I think he used that word. So I think he's saying the Boston School places such a focus on the technique or manner in which you paint to such a degree that it lacks the spirit of experimentation. I'm asking you again, what about my work lacks the spirit of experimentation? I don't look like Brackman. I don't look like Gamel. Now you'd say I don't experiment with false drawing. That's true. I don't do that. I actually have a whole fundamental thought, mindset about truth in painting, and value it actually. Love to paint the truth. And I think you straight and true like a Christian, the decamp thing, or make it as like as you possibly can, but not and make it more like. Those kinds of things. They're admittedly on my horizon. So, and they are in all three of these cases. That Brackman's not a guy. He's taking liberties, not meaningfully taking liberties. Most Western painters don't actually. The few that do, I mean, there are very few that do actually. The Bellinis and people like that. Until you get to the modern era, and then people are just all hell breaks loose. People do whatever the hell they want, and it looks like it. So that's me being about as serious and unpleasant as I can be. So forgive me. Um, so yeah. So one of the big questions that comes up, and I'm looking at your question here, so I don't have to keep reverting to it. I leave these images up so you can keep watching them. Um, but one of the questions that comes up is that question of how much experimentation actually happens and how much do you change out of your school, right? So now I studied with Gamel. Gamel was basically a Paxton School guy. Now you'd say Boston School and include Paxton, and those other three guys, the other three, maybe four even if you count Hale, really do something different and something fairly similar to each other. But the reason they're even together in the same room is because they think the same about this kind of painting. So in other words, they're rather buddies. I mean, DeCamp was from Cincinnati, but he didn't go back to Cincinnati. He hung out with these guys because their way of thinking was similar. And a school is not a place you go to learn this stuff. A school is a way of thinking and an approach to painting. Do you follow that? So if you understand that clearly, you'll see the Gamel here and the Brackman method. I mean, the Paxton method is outline based, and he's in the case of Gamel, he's piecing pictures together out of his imagination. These are imaginative works. I'm not doing any of that stuff. So, uh, yeah. So what happened to me though is I decided I wanted to be the master. I felt the first thing you've got to do if you really want to be a good painter, listening to all the great painters talk, is you have to master the look of nature. And I found that outlines around objects was really inhibiting that. And I was looking for best practices. I couldn't figure out how I could get to the place. By the way, Schmid said a similar thing, that you don't want to get to a place where you have 30 and 40 things wrong in your picture. Why does that keep happening, right? And that leads you naturally to a way of working that was just common to a bunch of these guys, including Sargent, Soren, Soroy, and other people, right across the board. Best practices. The outline-based work isn't the best practice. Now, a lot of what LAC does is outline-based. A lot of those guys that we're talking about, that you're comparing me to, are outline-based. So keep that in mind as you go along, thinking this stuff through. But I had to actually come to best practices, and the more I thought it through, and the more I worked, and the more efforts I made, and the more experiments I made, the closer I got to the Boston School. I had no love affair with the Boston School. I didn't want to be like them. I made no effort to be like them. And Gamel didn't teach it because he couldn't do it. And he says specifically, you can't teach what you can't do. And he admitted he couldn't do it, by the way. I don't put words into his mouth, right? And I don't think Lack could do it either. Lack didn't try to do it. Lack did. He told you if you wanted to do a complex impressionist painting, you had to do a preliminary study, ideally, with grisaille and all sorts of stuff. At least he makes that clear in this Realism and Revolution book. So look at that, think it through for yourself. And I'm writing this, I'm talking about this in rather detail because it matters specifically to Devin and Hal, that this thinking, and to people at that level who've been hanging around schools and have been done some work, so they have some idea what they're talking about. But now I'm going to just show you simple schools of work, and I'm going to ask you about who's doing what experimenting, right? Look at, I think I do Paragino, no, Bellini, okay. Did I misspell Bellini? Yes, I did. Should be an I in Bellini's name. So his two students, Giorgione and Titian, these are examples of their work. Can you make out the difference, right? I mean, it's very difficult to. These guys are all looking like, they're key pictures. I don't have all of them, but they do some very similar things. Blocks of solid color and certain kinds of colors, and their way of drawing is very similar. Everything about what they're doing looks like they are clones of each other. And so this guy, it isn't a school at that point. In one sense, well, I guess it's a school, but Bellini, they simply painted with Bellini. They painted on those pictures, as I understand it, right? And so whatever experimentation they did was incorporating new knowledge, other stuff. It wasn't wildly doing stuff with their brush in a spontaneous way. It was saying, Mr. Bellini, as much as we like you, we don't think you make as good a head as I'd like to be able to make. And I'm going to put a lot more effort into studying the head, just so we say. And various kinds of things like that. So we all do that. You evolve out of who your teacher was, but you plant your roots in your teacher because that's what you got. And then you move from there, right? It's inevitable. And when you don't have the ability, it's a big, not to take for granted today that you have the ability to see so much work that you may not get rooted. You may get wildly all over the place and never get roots, right? So you'll have to find out for yourself which is the greater loss, to have roots or to have no roots and just think you can root yourself in the air. A question, right? So from Bellini, we go to Paragino, and we're going to compare Paragino and Raphael. And somebody very nicely on the internet has put these two pictures together. Upper left is a Raphael, upper right is a Paragino, on which Raphael himself may possibly have worked. Isn't that interesting? But you see how far he's come. That's a long way from this, right? Well, it is actually. He's putting in a great deal more care into the architecture, the drawing of the architecture. This gets much more simplistic. His colors look more true and more lifelike in the environment that he's in. So he's improving on his master over time, right? But this looks like it could be a Paragino, right? And so the same is true here. If I told you this was a Raphael and that's a Paragino, you probably wouldn't believe me. But that's true. This is the Paragino, and that's a Raphael. The drawing even in this one actually looks better than the drawing in this one. But I'm telling you that these guys don't fall, the apple doesn't fall very far from the tree at all. What they do eventually, though, over the course of the next 20 years or whatever they have before, and Raphael didn't live a really long time. It was 33 or 37. But they got such early starts. Is that he began to evolve ideas of composition. And those are the kinds of ways he made his mark in composition and drawing, although he doesn't get really, really far from what I call the egghead of Paragino. It seems to more or less perpetually be his base. But when you see the difference between the truth in the School of Athens compared, which is a step up yet from the one on the left here, you should be able to see that he's evolving. No sudden, dramatic, strange shifts, but you plant your feet, you live in this world, you respect it enough to stay there, right? Or you would have studied with somebody else. Well, in their world, they might have been really stuck with the first thing, the only guy they could find, never found anybody better, so they put their roots in, learned what they could, and then evolved, right? And the evolution is slow in painting. It's, by the way, over time it's slow. And you try to become something. You're not going to turn in yourself from a these days, for you to say from a man to a woman. You're going to turn yourself from this kind of a guy to a slightly different version of that kind of a guy. It's about what you have the capacity to do in your life. Life is too short. I say that you won't respect it if you don't respect the other things I've already said, but So I'm showing you the Newland School here. Now, these are three different painters. And I tell me, you couldn't even begin to tell me which one is which. Now, which school can you tell the difference? It's a school of thought. These guys have the same ideas about nature, about how to handle all sorts of stuff, and they painted the same subjects. So the Newland School, but were these guys all just clones of each other? No, it was a way of thinking about nature. They wanted to get more truth, much like the Boston School, and to get more of the sense of outdoors. So they were doing things like reducing the value scheme a little bit, the value range a little bit, and various things like that. But there it is. That's a school, a school of thought. You could talk about the Karachi school. You could talk about, they're not schools per se. It's a way of thinking. And to some degree, there's some methodology involved that they share. So keep thinking that, keep understanding. That's what we mean by schools of thought. Yeah. There are a couple other things about it. By one of the points you make in here is that it says you say that when I browse the work, it's almost impossible for me to figure out which artists. They all look the same because they're all painting in the same manner. So you get that. It's totally understandable if they have the same way of thinking. They don't all come from the same place, the same school. Two of them do come from the same exact sort of lineage, but the other one doesn't. It comes out of a wildly different one. I'm talking about DeCamp. So where they got to wasn't because they studied with each other. DeCamp was older than the other two guys. But they settled on this way of thinking, this way of working, and they found themselves friends because of it. And the world then, turn them into a school, which it began to have its own identity, its own kind of look. But if you look closely, and I'm going to give you that chance, you'll see they're not cloning each other. So, but anyway, I said most of those things. Okay, so let's just move on to the next one. And I'm going to show you, I'm going to tell you that Duran was a school. It was like literally a teaching apparatus, right? So just like Bellini, he would teach you your stuff. So here on the left is a Duran. Is that not exactly what Sargent's doing? So Sargent plants his roots in Duran. That one on the right could easily be a Duran. And of course, it is Duran. So have that in mind, guys. Please, when you look at people, whoever you studied with, that's your school. That's your base, right? And Gamble used to like to say that, and really I find it to be so. You never lose the first influences, right? I don't know that Carlos truly was his first influence, but I think it was his primary influence. I say first, meaning he could have been a kid and had something in there. He certainly got around. He did have some time at the Beaux-Arts drawing, but a lot of that was going on at the same time as you were studying with somebody else in their private ateliers, which is what appears to be going on. I'm not the guy who's giving you the history. You can go read that for yourself. But here you can see plainly that this is the same guy. He paints exactly the same way. And even that sense of a sort of flair, at least in these two pictures, is there. They both, Carlos Duran's doing that. Carlos Duran himself is a little bit of a bon vivant, a bit of from what they say about him, he's a bit of a show-off and that sort of thing. So that pose likely fit his personality, which is something he would have taught, actually, for his students to do. Now, but now you said, so then you mentioned these other guys being so brilliant and so creative. I thought, what was your word? I've got to talk about this because I don't see any unique voice in the Boston School like you see when you look at Zorn, Sorolla, or even a Sargent. So I'm showing you that Sargent and Carlos Duran are the same guy. Where's the voice? Where's the special voice, right? Yeah, that's his evolution. He does he draws his own personality through that stuff. But he's got that same base. So you're not really seeing a difference. And you show those guys side by side. You got to show them in the context of the world they were born in. Every one of these guys was studying with somebody who had 2 or 3 or 5 other students, right? So which school are they really part of? Anyway, I'm showing you 4 pictures here, the right one. And I'm only cutting sections of them just to show you the head and the sort of the way of painting. These guys are all doing something really similar in the way of painting. They're all the same age. Sargent is 4 years, 6 years older than one, just a couple of years. They're all really in the same camp. They weren't studying with each other. The Boston School guys, they didn't see Sargent, at least they didn't see him in their painting milieu where they actually met him and all that sort of stuff in Boston till way later into their careers. I want to tell you, it was in the 1900s, so these guys would have all been at least 40-something. They would have all been practicing painters. And by the way, they're not clones in another way. They critique Sargent critique his painting out of his head, certain parts of like backgrounds of portraits. They say, look, he's painting the wall flat. Why is he doing that? These guys obviously weren't following Sargent. They're critiquing him. They're saying he's not moving the color of the walls. And that, of course, is because he wasn't an impressionist in that same way. And there's portraits, and I say it's not unusual for portraits to be more relatively frequently done from formulaic stuff that you've learned for the purposes of the efficiencies and the lower risk of failing at your job. Sargent does eventually, or all through, is incorporating a ton of color. He's got a great sense of color. All four of these guys do. But the one on the left is the best portrait I think I've ever seen by Sorolla. Many of them are really bland and dead. The one in the middle is a similar. I picked these guys because they're all wearing black stuff. But the one in the middle is Zorn. And Zorn is, so there he is, they're wearing black. And Zorn, okay, so Zorn's a clone of Sargent. Nah, they're born within a year or so of each other. All these guys are right there, the same age. None of them are cloning off each other. None of them are buying out of the others. And they might have been jealous of the other's success, but they weren't trying to imitate it. That's a low thing that most painters don't even begin to do. You get a few over time that do, and try to imitate somebody like Sargent and spend their lives doing that and lose their own soul, shall we say. But that isn't the Boston School. That isn't even close to who they were. So that's one of those things where you want to watch that kind of presumption. That's just not a reasonable thing to even assume, okay? They weren't jealous of him and they didn't copy him, okay? Their own way of working was their own way of working, and they were taught rather that way. You could see that direct painting kind of stuff was coming through the school they studied in first, which is the museum school under the Dutch guy, whatever his name was, whose name should come back to me any minute and won't. So now I'm showing you three distinct Boston School painters. You can see plainly the guy on the right is using, well, you can't see it here, but I can tell you the guy, that painting on the right is rotten with thick paint, crudded up, clumped up. The one in the middle isn't, and the one on the left is some ambivalent number of, bit in between. What's characteristic of them, though, is their love of the light. They actually, all of them, believed in speaking about the light. Now, the one on the left, to me, has elements that are problematical. He has rather unresolved backgrounds and stuff, but still, that's the one thing they have in common. And the second thing that they have in common is they don't paint from the outlines of objects. They paint with this concept of lost and found effects and things like that. And primarily, of course, all of them were saying, the idea is to paint the appearance of things, the right color, the right value, in the right place. All that conversation goes on all the time with these guys, right? So that's the common thread. But if you say these painters don't have personalities, I defy you to take them. I mean, it's just nuts, right? You just haven't looked long enough, so look longer, okay? All right. What other point did you make? Yeah, so they all look the same. That's one of those things that you say that about abstract painters, for example. They all look the same. Abstract painters, think representational painters look the same. It just means that they haven't studied, they haven't lived there. This thing about all whites look the same, all blacks look the same. Any race can do that, right? All Chinese look the same. You can say that all you want. But when you actually are part of that, you don't even believe that for a second. You see the difference is huge. And in every school, in every race, there's a body of that race that actually looks just like the other race. That sort of thing is continual. So it's a silly thing to say. I would just simply put it to you that it's a silly thing to say that all these guys look the same. Now, I'm really giving you an example here, though. Now, people think that Paxton is Boston School. And I'm suggesting to you that because he lived in Boston, was around these guys, Gamma allowed that to happen, or maybe even said it in so many words. But Boston School was a way of thinking. Paxton wasn't part of that, except in the sense that he believed that he wanted to paint the light. But he didn't paint from effects. He didn't paint from lost and found in the visual order, any of those things. He painted outlines of objects, just like Jerome might have, just like Ang, one of his heroes, might have, right? So these two guys, though, don't look at all the same. You can look at these on your own, but they're painted. One is painted out of the lost, found mindset, leading order painting. The other one's painted from outlines of objects. That's all there is to it. You can see plainly the result is different. So that's one of those things where you just haven't looked well enough, right? That doesn't mean there aren't aspects of Paxton that might actually be better in some ways. I mean, his color is remarkably true. And and even you might even argue that certain aspects of his drawing, I mean, certain parts of his drawing are definitely better than some parts of Benson's. But that's a question of focus, and Benson's focus was wildly different from the other guys as well. So just to keep clear what we're talking about here, I'm going to go back to your notes one more time. Just principles and techniques are good, but at a certain point you have to put it all aside and paint instinctively and react quickly instead of methodically, in my opinion. That's an opinion you should lose. If you're talking to Degas and about Sargent and all these guys, methodically, systematically, and with care, everything being done with a reason. That is to say, ultimately, every piece. That's why when Benson is talking, every piece of every mark you make is part of this design. You're searching out a design. So if you're doing spontaneous stuff, it means you're not aware of the whole. For example, what does spontaneous even mean? So it's not one of those things that you want to tell young people to do. You want to tell young people to paint straight and true, and learn to hit the note in front of them with truth and with humility, right? And get over this idea of expression and the throwing stuff at things, spontaneous mark making and stuff like that. It's fine to do it. I don't have a problem with people doing it. I'm just saying that's not the message you want to leave to young students. You want to say make yourself solid in your understanding your capacity and your expression of the truth. And then if you're Ang, he would say, and just paint more truth. The idea of drawing forth the beauty out of truth and the inner relationship, the unbreakable link between truth and beauty is such a huge thing. The history of Western art doesn't actually much respect people who go outside the lines, so to speak, of truth. That's one of those many things that defines our form, throughout what we consider great painting of the West, and even the Japanese, by the way. But in all cases, though, if you want to follow up on this, please define terms and show work the way you can actually say, "Don't you see?" That would be way better than to generalize, broad brush these ideas. I'm just saying for the purposes of video conversation. And so I am asking that, if you do that, go ahead and show these things side by side. Yeah. So my question to you was, which paintings in particular, compared with each other, can be compared to show your point, can be used to compare, to make your point? So that's where I'd end it. I think I've covered all I meant to cover. So let me just back up through this for a second and see if I've left anything out. I wanted to say one thing, by the way, this idea of painting relationally. The purpose of schools, in the sense of any school, any education of a painter, is about learning to see, which is learning to see the truthful relationships of things. It's not an inventive process. And you're trying to get people to be able to paint with honesty and with humility what they see in front of them. So keep that in mind. One of the other things you sort of dismissed was the idea of picture making. You seem to say, well, they had some. Here we go. It ultimately puts such a rigid focus on principles that are more about getting a great painting, so that it seems to me to have pumped out a lot of guys that just paint the same. I don't know what it is, by the way. That's why I say you really got to fix that. But it just pumped out. But what is this that they do? They are trying to get a great painting. What are you trying to do? Are you trying to do something else? So that's an interesting question. Now, does it mean great painting? They have a definition that says paintings must do this, must do that. Well, you do too. Everybody does, actually. And that very concept about expression that Hal brings up says that. You have your own idea of what makes a great painting, and you are striving to do that. Everybody is, right? But Gamel's thing was, I'm going to teach you how to make pictures, and it's going to be up to you beyond that, right? But this whole idea was to have a school based on, his case, an atelier based on making the picture. So that I don't have anything else to say about that. But I think I've answered all the questions, made all that discussion, and I think I did it in 30 minutes. Brilliant, way better than the last time. My producer's going to be so excited. All right. So for all of you who know, who love and know the underlying concept here, which is that there is a yes in painting that we all want to be part of, understand that there are times when you're being attacked personally, that you actually might, or even you're being accused of things, you might want to make a defense of some sort. But this isn't defense. Let's just look at the idea of schools, think it through, and understand that schools of thought aren't the same thing as schools where you go and learn something. And I will suggest to you that there's right now a sort of a clone proposition going out there. Everybody's teaching this site size. Everybody's teaching the Barg method, copying these Barg method things till their eyes fall out. I mean, this whole thing is producing a mechanical, robotic thing, in my view, at least at the moment. In the long run, it's not going to stay that way because people break out of it. And so I don't know what those guys are. You compared me to a couple guys that I don't even begin to work like. So that just means that you haven't been in the field. You don't know my field from within. You just know it from without, which means that you can't make judgments about it except general ones about your feelings about it or something like that. But to say that we all look the same, what would that be? You're a representational painter. You don't look the same. You must look the same as somebody. So, all right, for everybody who's doing these things, though, I do hope that something positive comes out of this. And if nothing else, you just learn to think things through and keep having fun, hitting the note. All right, take care. See you next time. And I look forward. This is what is today, Thursday. So please do come on in Saturday for our live event. Come in with your whatever conversation, questions, discussion you want to have, and let's have a good time together. All right, 5:30 this coming Saturday, 5:30 Eastern Standard Time, and see you there. Okay. All right. And thank you, by the way, everybody commenting, including you guys, by the way, Devin, who you've made nice comments before, valuable comments, and Hal. But thank you for all that stuff. Thank you for subscribing, for donating, and for everything. Sharing is a good one. All right. And we'll see you Saturday, if not sooner. All right.